By now, Israel and Hamas should have moved to phase 2 of their ceasefire deal. Instead, Palestinians are burying their dead. But did Israel ever want peace in Gaza? And far from the front lines on American university campuses, is there another battle brewing over the right to free speech and the right to protest? It's all up for debate on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora. When an Israeli airstrike shattered the fragile Gaza ceasefire, it also blew up the notion for some that the Netanyahu government was ever interested in a lasting peace, especially with threats like this from the defence minister.
Take the advice of the U.S. president. Return the hostages and get rid of Hamas, and we will open new opportunities, including leaving to other places in the world for whoever wants it. The alternative is complete destruction and devastation.
That makes it sound as if there hasn't been utter destruction and devastation up until this point. So if the situation is set to get even worse, when does the international community step in to hold either or both sides accountable? Or has this conflict signalled the end of the rules-based order? It's perhaps no surprise then that the return to fighting in Gaza has seen the return to protesting in the US. President Donald Trump has promised to crack down on pro-Palestinian protests, blurring the lines between free speech and hate speech.
To the weaponization of Judaism to be used as some sort of excuse to crack down on civil liberties, and in particular on our Palestinian and Arab brothers and sisters. This is intolerable to me.
So important to say that America's a, constitutional liberal democracy where we're allowed to speak and not be retaliated against for what we believe in.
So I don't want anti-Semitism to be weaponized to promote these draconian rules.
Sorry for speaking.
Today on Counterpoints, our panel will debate if Israel ever wanted a lasting peace, whether this conflict has signalled the end of the rules-based order, and if there is any justification for US campus clampdowns. Stay with us on Counterpoints. We are at a crucial moment in the Israel-Hamas conflict. To discuss all the recent developments, I'm joined by the Palestinian Kuwaiti journalist and analyst Ahmed Eldin and Alan Dershowitz, the Emeritus Professor of Law at the Harvard University and author of The Case for Israel. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us here on Counterpoints. It took such a long time to reach this ceasefire, and now it feels like we are further away from it than ever before. Both sides have accused each other of stalling tactics and not negotiating in good faith. So let me ask you, who do you think is responsible for the breakdown of the current ceasefire? Professor Dershowitz, let's start with you.
Well, we have to go back a little to 2005 when the Prime Minister of Israel ended the occupation of Gaza and tried to set up a two-state solution, beginning with Gaza, giving the Gazans complete independence. They could have become Singapore on the Mediterranean. They could have had a completely independent state. Instead, there was a coup. Hamas took over, sent thousands of rockets into Israel, and then on October 7th, started a genocidal war in which they killed 1,200 innocent people, many of them peace advocates, and captured and kidnapped 250 of them. If there is to be an end to this conflict, it has to come from first a return of the hostages. They are being unlawfully held under international law. They're being brutally treated. And if they are returned, there will be a ceasefire. So the failure to return and the idea that giving one American back with 4 or 5 dead bodies somehow is enough to justify ending Israel's self-defense tactics simply is never going to do it. So it's all in Hamas's responsibility, and it's in Hamas's court. And if they were to today to announce on the show or anywhere else that they are going to return a significant number of hostages, there would be a ceasefire. And then maybe we could move toward a permanent ceasefire and ultimately toward a two-state solution.
Ahmed?
Well, I think the facts are what we should look at first. I mean, over 900 violations of the ceasefire means that there was actually never a ceasefire. It was just a tactical timeout to reload for Israel. I mean, the only difference between the last few weeks and today is the intensity being accelerated with which Israel is systematically murdering a population that is 50% or more children. Look, facts are important, and I hope, despite knowing me and Alan are going to disagree, we can stick to the facts. And some of the facts are that, you know, Alan, you spend decades branding yourself as a civil libertarian, a champion of free speech. But when it comes to Palestine, you don't defend liberty or freedom. You defend occupation, apartheid, and genocide. And, you know, you do it with the same tired playbook that the Israeli government does. You misrepresent international law. You dismiss Palestinian suffering as propaganda, and you gaslight the world into believing that Israel, the nuclear armed occupier, is the victim here. I mean, let's be clear about the facts. Israel is not defending itself. It is enforcing a system of ethnic domination and ethnic cleansing. And it's not my opinion. You know, this is a fact under international law. Consider this. You know, it's Friday today. In just a few days since Tuesday, Israel has killed at least 600 Palestinians and injured more than 900. It's massacred more than 200 children, according to UNICEF. 40% of the 600 plus Palestinians that Israel's killed in just the last 72 hours are reported to be under 14. In hospitals, there's no anesthesia. 7 children have had their legs amputated while fully awake. I mean,
let me ask you this, though, Ahmed, before I turn this back over to Professor Dershowitz. I want to ask, you say that this was just a stalling tactic so Israel could regather itself and rearm, but there has been an argument that Hamas has used this for the exact same purposes and that they have been rearming, and there are reports that they've recruited about 1,000 new fighters during this ceasefire. So couldn't you argue also that they haven't been adhering to really upholding the ceasefire themselves?
If you think that that's an argument that they're not upholding the ceasefire, then maybe we're not clear on what the ceasefire is. Of course, they're recruiting new people. I would imagine any people who are being, bombarded with massive airstrikes, starvation, complete siege would recruit people to resist and try to survive. And quite frankly, you know, I understand why you're positing the question as such. But let's be clear about one thing. Western media has parroted the myth of a fragile truce, while Israel has been bombarding hospitals, refugee camps, and even designated safe zones. So when, you know, it's maddening to me. I mean, when a ceasefire was agreed upon to end the suffering, it was supposed to be a 3-phase deal that promised a halt to the bloodshed, hostage exchanges, and negotiations for peace. Netanyahu chose power over human life. He chose power over the hostages, as he has, which is why more than 200 of the top businessmen in Israel are challenging him and his complete kind of dismissal and disregard in a so-called democracy of the High Court's decision when he got rid of the Shin Bet intelligence leader. Look, Netanyahu has been stalling. The Israeli ministers have said, including those in his coalition, that there cannot be a ceasefire, that the ceasefire must be violated. I've told you that they've violated it 900 times. They've been carpet bombing. I mean, this was never...
All right, well, let's turn it over to the professor now. All right, Professor, what do you think? 900 violations, was this just a tactical timeout for Israel to regroup, and were they always going to relaunch this attack?
The last thing Israel needed was a timeout. It was winning every aspect of the war. It was winning the war against the Houthis, winning the war against Hezbollah, winning the war against Hamas. If it had just continued, it could have wiped out Hamas, and then we could have a two-state solution. I want to focus on children. This is the big lie. Remember that Hamas recruits children to become combatants at the age of 13.
That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a lie, that children have been caught up in the recent bombings.
No, there's a question. Children are combatants. Children with rifles, children with rockets.
I'm sorry, Alan, are you trying to justify the murder of hundreds of children by suggesting that Hamas actually recruits them into being fighters? So the toddlers who are 2 years old are fighters?
I'm not talking toddlers. Let me finish your interruption.
Let's talk about the toddlers in the thousands that have been killed by Israel, because you're doing the very same thing that I announced at the top of the program that you would do, which is...
All right. Let's let Professor Dershowitz finish his comment, and then we'll come back to you, Ahmed.
Sure. I'm not talking about the 2-year-olds or the 5-year-olds or the 10-year-olds or even the 12-year-olds. I'm talking about the 19-year-olds who were counted as children, the 18-year-olds who were counted as children, the mass murderers who were counted as children. Remember, among the people who crossed the border and raped and beheaded and burnt alive Israelis were 15-year-olds and 16-year-olds.
I'm sorry, Melinda, but if you're going to allow him to propagate and peddle disinformation that's been debunked, then that's on you.
Sorry. I'm not going to continue this if you continue to interrupt. So when you kill a 15-year-old...
If you're going to say things that are factually incorrect, isn't it my job as your opponent to challenge you on your lies and propaganda?
You'll have to dispute it. When you kill a 15-year-old who is in the process of raping a woman or in the process of killing somebody, that's a good thing. The fact that he was 15 is the fault of Hamas, not the fault of Israel. And what about the 2- and 3-year-olds? They're being used as human shields. Hamas fighters are fighting in areas where they know there are 2-year-olds. Look at Sinwar. He is now surrounding himself with children and babies and hostages because he's a coward. He's afraid to come out and fight. And so all the deaths that are being caused, and they're being misreported, obviously, the ratio of civilian to combatant deaths is lower than in any war in modern history. The ratio is approximately 1-to-1 if you don't count combatants, women who are combatants. They can be women and combatants at the same time, 17-year-olds who are combatants. The ratio is approximately 1-to-1. The average ratio fighting wars like this is 7-to-1. That is 7 civilians killed for every combatant. That was true when Afghanistan, that was true in Iraq, that was true with NATO, that was true with Britain, that was true with the United States. Israel has the absolute best ratio of killing the fewest number of civilians. But again, none of this would have happened had we not had October 7th. Are you willing now to tell me and say that October 7th began the war, October 7th was a terrorist attack, October 7th was a violation of international law, and if not for October 7th, there would be peace between Israel and Hamas? Are you prepared to say that?
All right, Ahmed, respond to that before we move on.
Let's, first of all, stop pretending that Alan is doing anything other than making up lies and can't back them up with facts. Second of all, you're talking to me, let me finish. You're talking to me about October 7th. It's March 21st. You're talking to me about October 7th because you don't want to talk about every single day since October 7th and before October 7th. So as I said, let's stop pretending that this is a war. It's an enforcement of an occupation, a military onslaught against a people with no army, no air force, and no means of escape. So to Melinda's earlier question, I would just like to point out, you're saying Hamas is this assertion that Hamas is somehow rearming. There's no food, water, or medicine being allowed into the Gaza Strip. Israel controls all the borders. If we're going to have a discussion, Alan, as a professor, I would hope, although I know better, than to expect you to argue the facts. Israel, like yourself, continues to claim that this is all being done in self-defense, that tens of thousands of children are being murdered in self-defense, as if a nuclear-armed state backed by the most powerful military in the world needs to defend itself against starving, displaced civilians and children that you're claiming are human shields. Alan, I know you're going to say Israel is targeting Hamas, but tell me, did Hamas hide inside the 450 Palestinians that Israel slaughtered in just a few hours, a few days ago? You want to talk about October 7th, but you don't want to talk about that because you cannot justify the 179 children and 89 erased erased on the 17th night of the holy month of Ramadan.
Don't be sexist. Women are terrorists. They have guns. They have rockets. 19-year-olds are terrorists. So stop using children, stop using women, and start using the actual term.
This argument is so tired. Okay, Israel.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this discussion now onto who mediated this ceasefire or how we got here. with the backing of the United States and whether or not they are an impartial mediator. Before we get into that discussion, I want you both to take a listen to Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary who spoke to reporters recently outside the White House. Have a listen to her comments here before we come back to the discussion.
Well, the president made it very clear to Hamas that if they did not release all of the hostages, there would be all hell to pay. And unfortunately, Hamas chose to play games in the media with lives. This situation, let's not forget, is completely the fault of Hamas when they launched that brutal attack on Israel on October 7th. And the president has made it very clear that he wants all of those hostages to come home, and he fully supports Israel and the IDF and the actions that they've taken in recent days.
Professor Dershowitz, is it counterintuitive for America to be pushing for a deal, to say it wants peace, while it is arming one side and purporting for the total destruction of the other?
Not at all. Israel is a democracy that is fighting self-defense. America is on its side. America is not neutral. America completely supports Israel and completely opposes Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist group. It's illegal in the United States. Providing material support for Hamas is a crime. You know, that's like saying a country should be neutral in the Second World War toward Hitler. No, Hamas is the Nazis. Hamas is Hitler. Sinwar is Hitler. These are people, look at the Hamas charter. The Hamas charter is the same as the Nazi charter. They want to kill every single Jew who lives anywhere in the Middle East. Look,
but not every person in Gaza is Hamas. Not everyone supports Hamas.
Say it again?
Not everyone in Gaza is Hamas. There are people who are being caught up in this who aren't part of Hamas.
Of course, and there are people in Israel who aren't supporters of Netanyahu. In a war, people get killed on both sides. Hamas started the war. There's no doubt about that. I have not heard Ahmed admit yet that on October 7th, Hamas started the war. By starting the war, they exposed their civilians just the way when the Nazis started the war in 1939, they knew there'd be tens of millions of German civilians killed. That's what happens in war. If you don't want civilians to be killed, you don't do two things. You don't start a war, and you don't put your civilians as human shields. If you use your civilians as human shields, and by the way, Sinwar said that in his dying declaration, just before he died, he praised the martyrs who were human shields. We have tape recordings of Hamas leaders praising human shields. We are all martyrs. Sinwar said he wants civilians to be killed. Every time Israel kills a civilian, that helps Hamas. So let's put the responsibility where it is, squarely with Hamas.
Ahmed, what do you think? Ahmed, do you think that there could have been a ceasefire without the United States?
I think the United States is as complicit and guilty of... Are you going to just speak over me? Are you going to just not let me speak? Is that what's happening? Thank you. I think the U.S. is as guilty of ethnic cleansing and genocide as Israel is, because they've been backing Israel, not just since October 7th, but for decades. And they've been backing a systematic campaign to ethnically cleanse the native population. Now, Alan is saying the same thing over and over because he can't say anything else, because he can't argue the facts. But he does like to talk about free speech. And you did ask about the U.S. and its role. Alan, can I just speak? Are you afraid of my truth?
I do, though, Ahmed, want you to answer the question I posed to you.
I will answer the question. I will answer. Which was the question about the U.S. and whether is that
tell me whether do you think the U.S. could this ceasefire have been reached without the U.S., even though perhaps they're not a neutral negotiator?
They're certainly not a neutral negotiator. I think all three of us and like my 5-year-old niece could agree on that. But Alan, you know, I don't think that they could have, to answer your question, because the U.S. is integral to this entire genocide. And Alan, like I was saying, you know, let's talk about what's happening in America and why perhaps the U.S. is unable to be a fair broker for peace. I mean, how do you explain a nation so eager to gut its own freedoms, as we've seen them do in the recent, weeks, on behalf of a foreign state whose leaders have not only an international arrest warrant out for their war crimes, including starvation by the ICC, but how do we explain Columbia University, my alma mater, where I also was an adjunct professor for several years, turning students over to ICE to deport them without charge, without charging them with a crime. I mean, Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian, can I finish? Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian doctoral student, arrested in broad daylight in front of his 8-month pregnant wife by unnamed agents wearing Avengers shirts. I mean, it's insane to me that we're sitting here having a debate about America perhaps not being a fair broker. I mean, Jewish students protesting genocide, Alan, are being expelled for protesting against genocide and ethnic cleansing, which, as you know, millions of Jews were the victims of during the Holocaust. Grant Minor, the Jewish Columbia student and president of the Student Workers of Columbia United Auto Workers, was expelled by the university for protesting. Meanwhile, those who speak out are being silenced, like a French researcher just a few days ago being
We are going to
upon
come to free speech really shortly. I want to move this on. You were mentioning free speech there, Ahmed. We are going to come to that really shortly. But I want to move our discussion on to accountability. Because under international law, warring parties are expected to adhere to rules of distinction to minimise civilian casualties, as you've both been discussing already, but also proportionality. However, the ceasefire-ending strike from Israel a few days ago killed more than 500 Palestinians. Yes, Hamas says that they were targeting terrorists, but as we have been discussing, almost half of those were children. Now, the ICC has issued arrest warrants for both Israeli and Hamas leaders, but often those warrants are never acted on. So, Ahmed, I want to ask you, if we look at this more broadly, has this conflict forever upended this notion that the West is adhering to the international rules-based order?
Yes, I do think that it has. And it's evident in how Alan and other apologists are perfecting the art of reframing facts and doing it in order to disregard the rule of law, which we're all supposed to abide by. I mean, when a hospital is bombed, it's called a strike on Hamas infrastructure. When tens of thousands of Palestinians are buried in rubble, it's dismissed as collateral damage. Israel tells civilians to evacuate safe zones only to bomb them next. I mean, this is a systematic campaign that is manufacturing consent for genocide. And, you know, we're also seeing the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, Israel's collective punishment of the Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, making it seem as if this is a conflict, right? This is two equal sides fighting that are rearming, that are, you know, rather than an occupying force systematically erasing
they don't have to be equal for it to be a conflict. International wars are never always equal, unfortunately.
But why is this, I hear you, but why is this not ever the situation when we talk about Russia in the media? I mean, Israel's genocide against Palestinians...
I would argue that there is a discussion about that in some parts of the media.
I would argue that it's not the same discussion and not to the same extent. I mean, collective punishment, when Russia does it, it's a war crime. The media says it, undeniably. All European governments say it. When Israel does it, with more intensity, in more violation, for decades, not only is it funded and defended, I mean, the International Court of Justice explicitly warned against what Israel is doing, and Israel's doing it anyway. No consequences, no sanctions, no arms embargo. That doesn't happen when Russia annexes or attacks, you know, innocent civilians in Ukraine, right?
Okay, I think Professor Dershowitz wants to intervene. What do you think? This plays right into your field of expertise. International law here. How can Israel stand in front of the world and say that they are not breaching any international rules of engagement?
They are not. They're completely in compliance. They are a compliant country. In the history of warfare, they always use the concept of proportionality, but they are being attacked. Remember, they are being attacked asymmetrically by a group that admits it doesn't accept the rules of law. Recently, Hamas has targeted Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. They haven't even tried to excuse it. They are trying to kill as many civilians as possible. The goal of Hamas has always been to kill civilians. They make no effort at distinction or at proportionality. As many civilians as they can kill, they kill. They also want Palestinian civilians to die. That's part of their philosophy. The more Palestinian civilians are dead, and the more you can call them children and women, the more somebody like Ahmed could get on television and try to blame it all on Israel. Israel doesn't benefit when it kills a civilian.
Professor, I want to ask you, though, you say that they are upstanding international citizens, but there were very credible reports that suggest that Israel loosened their rules of engagement at the start of the Gaza war to allow attacks despite heightened risks of civilian targets. So how can you excuse that?
That's exactly right. Countries change their rules of engagement all the time. Proportionality requires context. And when you're fighting an enemy that uses children and uses human shields, of course you have to change your rules, but the rules are still consistent with proportionality. There is no country in the world—
Oh, I'm sorry, you have to change the rules to somehow justify and enable you to kill children and find a way to justify it. Of course, that's, as a professor of international law, you're saying that this happens all the time. Forget the treaties that we've signed, forget Israel's own constitution. And I mean, it's laughable, sadly, if it wasn't so obscene to hear you say this, Professor.
You're not going to let me finish.
We'll let the professor finish.
Israel has gone to more effort. Israel has risked more of its soldiers than any country in the history of modern warfare to reduce the number of civilian deaths on the other side, and for a very obvious selfish reason. Every time a civilian dies, every time a child dies, every time a woman dies, Israel is hurt. And every time that happens, Hamas is helped. That's why Hamas wants civilians to die. They want Jewish civilians to die. They want Muslim civilians to die. They want Christian civilians to die. That's part of their policy. That's part of their game plan. Israel has exactly the opposite goal. It wants to reduce the number of civilians. It gains nothing from killing civilians. And
so
if Hamas—
can I ask a quick question, if you don't mind? Can I ask a quick question?
Let me finish. If Hamas would stop using human shields, they would return the hostages.
You're just repeating yourself. How can we let you finish?
All right. Let me turn it over to you, though, Ahmed, because I want to ask, do you accept, though, that if we're talking about proportionality here, Hamas has to bear some responsibility for the current devastation and the current situation in Gaza?
Sure, but that's not what Alan is saying.
But that's what I'm asking you. So tell me what you think about that.
I said, sure, I do think they have some responsibility, but I'm saying that, and I just want to clarify for your viewers, that Alan said Israel has no responsibility, right? And I just think that says a lot in of itself. Alan, I don't know if you're going to answer this, but after I finish my points, I'd love to know, why then are Israeli leaders saying there's no such thing as a civilian if Israel is trying very hard? I mean, it's kind of conflicting, right? For so many Israeli leaders to come out and say that everybody in Gaza is a target. There's no such thing as— you're interrupting me. I'm almost done.
Why? Of course there's civilians. Everybody knows there's civilians. It's a lie.
So then why are the Israeli leaders saying this? Kind of, what is this language? It doesn't prove genocide. You don't think that this proves genocidal intent? And that's the reason that the ICJ, that's the reason that the ICJ found that Israel is plausibly committing genocide? Alan, you are one of the architects of this framing, as we've witnessed on this program. You twist language the same way Israel twists facts, because without propaganda, this kind of brutality could never be justified. Even if, as Melinda asked me, Hamas has a burden to pay or some responsibility. And Alan, I know that somewhere in that hollow body of yours, you know that what I'm saying is true, because you love to talk about international law when it serves you. So tell me, when does international law allow starving an entire population? When does it allow bombing hospitals? Does international law say if the Hamas boogeyman—
All right, okay, I want to turn it over. I want the professor to be able to answer your question there, Ahmed. I want the professor to be able to answer that. So, Professor, under international law, do you think that Israel has upheld its part of the bargain, letting in humanitarian aid? It's been criticised across the board for that. How can they justify it?
And the criticism is wrong. Israel has allowed more humanitarian aid than the United States ever allowed into Germany, than any country has
But we're
ever
not talking
allowed
about the World War II. A
You
lot
should
has
be
happened
so
in the world
proud
since
of
World
that
War II.
lie.
Who has heard of an enemy providing oil and gas so that the enemy can use it for its rockets? Of course, Israel has to make sure that the material that's going to the Gaza is not being used by Hamas as weapons. And Israel has opened up the corridors. It only closed the corridors after Hamas refused to release the hostages that it did pursuant to a deal. Let me talk about the International Criminal Court. It is a fake court. It is a UN court. Its members are picked by their countries. They have to do the biting of their. The Chinese judge will be executed if he doesn't follow the Chinese government. The International Criminal Justice is not a real court. It's a fake court. Nobody should listen to it. International law is important as long as it's administered fairly. But when you have courts condemning Israel more than all the other countries of the world combined, including in the Sudan.
Perhaps that's because Israel's committing systemic violations that violate the international law in a way that no other country has.
There's a new concept. It's called Palestinianism. I have a book about it. And it believes that the only group in the world that deserves support are Palestinians, and the only group in the world that deserves condemnation is Israel. And what's happened is Palestinianism is destroying human rights and turning human rights into only Palestinian rights, ignoring the rights of the people in Darfur who are actually starving, the people in other parts of the world who are actually starving. The Palestinians have caused their own problems. They could have had a state.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, they caused their own problems.
Respond to that before we move on. Respond to that for us, Ahmed.
Honestly, it just sounds like I'm speaking to like a child. I don't know. He's still speaking. I hear him in the background yelling like a crazy person. And honestly, I hate to make it like I'm attacking you personally, but I'm quite appalled at your level of not being informed on basic international law. Melinda, as you know, assassinating and targeting journalists and their families is a war crime.
Are you in favor of a two-state solution?
Are you still speaking? Are you not going to let me speak? I don't want to talk. We're not talking about the two-state solution. We're talking about you actively finding very bizarre ways to justify genocide. Look, Melinda, we hear about Israel's right to defend itself. And for your audience, it's important for me. Are you going to keep interrupting me?
We're going to come back to you in a moment, Professor. Let's let Ahmed finish, and then we're going to come back to you because we're going to move on really shortly. Ahmed, wrap this up for us.
I'll wrap it up for you. We hear it over and over. Israel has the right to defend itself. Alan just said it. But let's be clear. Israel is not invoking self-defense against another sovereign state. It is invoking self-defense against the very people it occupies. Now, I know Alan very conveniently wants to blame everything on Hamas and the Palestinians themselves and Palestinianism. He sounds like a child. What you call self-defense amounts to the bombing of neighborhoods, the destruction of entire communities, and the systematic starvation of more than 2 million people. And under international law, an occupier, as you know, Alan, has no right to claim self-defense against the people it occupies. So why then are the audience asking, can I just finish? Why then is the burden of proof always, as Alan is putting it, on the oppressed? Never the oppressor. When Hamas fires rockets, Israel and its allies call it terrorism. But when Israel flattens entire neighborhoods or sends pagers to Lebanon, which the former CIA director admitted very openly is a mass terror attack, it's called collateral damage. I mean, Alan, you've spent your career twisting legal arguments to justify Israel's brutality, and I get that. But tell me, if a foreign army invaded your home, demolished your neighborhoods, and executed your family, would you agree that such actions were self-defense?
Okay, let's let Professor Dershowitz respond before we move on. Right of reply to you, Professor.
Hamas invaded a peaceful area, a peaceful music festival, and murdered and raped everybody. Yes, I think that is aggression and attempted genocide. And
Melinda,
yes,
you're aware you didn't answer
just
my
let the
question,
professor finish. Thanks, Ahmed.
Well, you didn't answer my question.
Israel is fighting a nation. The nation Israel is fighting is called Iran. Iran has armed Hamas. Iran has armed the Houthis. Iran has armed Hezbollah. And Israel is fighting against a four-pronged attack to destroy its very existence. Remember, Hamas's charter demands that Israel not exist. I have favored a two-state solution since 19 1967. I continue to favor a two-state solution. I would like Ahmed to answer my question directly. Do you support a two-state solution in which there is a Palestinian state living in peace next to a Jewish state called the nation-state of Israel? Do you support that? Answer.
Alan, I'm not a monkey that you can make answer when you're not engaging me. No, why would I answer him if he didn't answer me? He started talking about Hamas. And by the way, my name is Ahmed.
Okay,
My name is
okay.
Ahmed.
Let's not descend into
No, I'm not
that discussion. Unless you're going to answer Professor's comment, I'm going to move on.
Okay, I'll answer the question. I support truth and facts, and I support Palestinians living in freedom and liberation from the river to the sea, just like Jewish citizens of this state, whatever you want to interpret that as. But I do want to say, you know, we haven't talked about, Alan, the fact that you built your entire, I'm sorry?
Israel.
I'm sorry?
You believe there should not be a country called Israel because you say...
No, that's what you're saying. I said what I said. I know what you're trying to do because you're the kind of guy... Look, Alan, let's be honest.
Okay, I'm going to move this on because we've still got...
Melinda,
we still have...
Why is he allowed to say that and then I can't defend myself?
Okay, okay, but make it snappy.
Okay, you defend individuals like Jeffrey Epstein, justify the targeting of killing civilians and children, and you're arguing that torture is sometimes necessary. Now you stand before us and you defend the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. At what point, Alan, do you stop asking questions of me that don't make sense, and do you start asking yourself and admitting that your legal arguments are nothing more than a cover for genocide?
Okay, all right, I'm going to move it on. Gentlemen, you were discussing a little bit earlier, Ahmed, about student protests about Columbia University. So the debate around free speech has heated up again in the US following the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, a demonstration leader at New York's Columbia University. He was arrested and campus protesters have been accused of anti-Semitism, but they argue that they're rallying against the Israeli government's actions and not against all Jewish people. So, Professor Dershowitz, let me ask you first. Are these clampdowns on protesters justified in any way if they're protesting and we talk about the amendment of free speech?
I'm completely in favor of protests. I'm completely in favor of free speech. I defended Palestinians and the Harvard campus and their right to put up a Palestinian flag. I defend Khalil's right to write a letter from prison in which he expresses his free speech. That letter has gotten more attention than all of his previous statements together. What they don't support is people getting into the country fraudulently. And there's every reason to believe that Khalil, when he made his visa application, denied that he supports terrorism or terrorist groups. If he, in fact, was supporting Hamas and was supporting October 7th, then he committed fraud in getting his visa and his green card. That doesn't mean he doesn't have free speech rights. He can speak from outside the country. He can do Zooms. Nobody is suppressing anybody's right of free speech. I want as much free speech as possible, but people should not be allowed to come into the country. Being admitted to the United States is not a right. It's a privilege if they are using it to prevent other people's free speech. Remember, Khalil's group prevented Jewish students from going to class. They disrupted a professor who was trying to teach about the Middle East. They occupied buildings. They attacked janitors. Those are not protected free speech. So I'm completely in favor of protecting the free speech both of Jewish students and of protesters who don't believe that Jewish students should have free speech. But I don't believe in the right to occupy buildings. I don't believe in the right to take over classrooms. I don't believe in the right to intimidate or harass Jewish students. And that's what Khalil is accused of doing. And so there'll be a trial. There'll be a hearing. We'll find out whether he got his...
That's actually correct. That's not what he was accused of.
All right, Ahmed, what's your take? Is this free speech or is this a crackdown?
Say it again.
I think it's again, it says a lot. It says a lot that, you know, Alan can't even admit that America is undergoing a very deliberate and overt attack on free speech and the Constitution. A French researcher was detained upon arrival in the US. His phone and laptop were confiscated, his private messages scrutinized by federal agents, and his only crime was criticizing Trump's cuts to scientific research. I know that's not about Mahmoud Khalil and the demonization that you were trying to draw up there, but DHS agents have actually labeled his words as hatred of Trump. That could be described as terrorism. So, he was deported the next day. But Alan, as you know, Alan, let me finish. Alan, as you know, not everyone, Alan, let me finish. Not everyone gets treated like this. For example, as a former professor at Columbia myself, Shai Davide, an Israeli professor who has spent 2 years. Can I just finish?
Yeah.
I spent 2 years harassing colleagues, spewing all kinds of propaganda, calling for the death of Arabs, and protesting so aggressively that even Columbia suspended him. But has he been deported? Has he been arrested? Has he been branded a national security threat? Why is this? Well, Melinda, it's very simple. Because in today's America, free speech in America only applies when your words serve power. And that's a hypocrisy that Alan is defending when it's convenient, and we ignore it when it exposes Israel's oppression, occupation, and collective punishment.
I want to ask you actually then, Professor, let me turn that to you. There is a difference between the Jewish people as a community and the Israeli government. So is it a tactic to conflate the two for political reasons?
No, it's not. When you single out only the one nation state of the Jewish people, Israel, for unique condemnation, when you ignore Sudan, when you ignore what's going on in the rest of the world, when you only protest the nation state of the Jewish people and apply a double standard to it, that's anti-Semitism. There are Jewish anti-Semites, just like there are Arab anti-Muslims. That's true of every single culture. But the idea that you apply a double standard to the one nation state in the world, that is the Jewish state, obviously is a form of anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism has become a euphemism for anti-Semitism. And when a member of Congress says it's the Benjamins, baby, that's the only reason that there's support for Israel, that's anti-Semitism.
So do you think that there's no way people can criticize the actions of the Israeli government without being anti-Semitic?
All the time.
Let me ask you again, Professor, do you think there's any way that people can criticize the actions of Benjamin Netanyahu's government and criticize the actions of what the government is doing and not be anti-Semitic?
Absolutely. As the vast majority of Israelis who read Haaretz and who read the Jewish Daily Forward are critical of the Israeli government. If you're Jewish, you can be critical of the Israeli government. If you're an Arab or a Muslim and you're critical of Hamas, be executed.
So why then are Jewish students being expelled and
off a roof if you're a member of Hamas? So let's understand the double standard that we're hearing. It's okay for Hamas to do all the things it does: anti-gay, anti-trans, anti-women, anti-Semitic, anti-everything. That's okay because somehow they're oppressed. But what Israel does is subject to super criticism. I just want a single standard of criticism. And I'm perfectly happy to criticize the Netanyahu government as I have. I don't think the head of Shin Bet should have been fired, but that's not your business. That's not my business. Israel's a democracy, unlike Hamas. Unlike any Arab state in the world, Israel is a democracy, and people have free speech rights to criticize it, whether you're Jewish or not. And I will continue to criticize the Israeli government, to criticize Hamas, and I will apply a single standard of criticism, no matter what the ethnic background is.
Ahmed?
I mean, to suggest that Israel is a democracy, again, just ignores the basic facts. It's a supremacist state where Jews enjoy a completely different legal system, and I don't want to get bogged down in talking.
Let's not.
I'm sorry?
Let's not get bogged down in that. That's a conversation for another day.
Let's not. Yeah. But what I will say is, if you don't want to believe me, I mean, you say, that your question was very well framed, and I think it highlights something very troubling. We've heard from Israeli genocide scholar, of course, who have criticized the Israeli government for waging this genocide. His name is Raz Segal. He says how, the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, the real struggle, actually puts Jewish people at risk. And so, this conflation, as you said, of a people and a state, it's really troubling. And, we're here saying we're willing to criticize the Israeli government. Alan, you keep saying this war is about Hamas and hostages, and that Israel is fighting to bring them home. But I want to ask you, Netanyahu accepted the ceasefire deal, and why would he then not prioritize the hostages' release as the families have been demanding just a few days ago, marching to the border with Gaza? He hasn't, because if he has, he wouldn't be carpet bombing Gaza. He escalated the bombing, risking even the lives of his own citizens, and his war cabinet, as you must know, I hope, is fracturing. His approval ratings are plummeting, and his only recourse is endless bloodshed. I mean, Netanyahu's actions by rejecting the ceasefire deal and stalling the hostage negotiations, as well as intensifying the military assault, are clearly not designed to secure safety for any people, let alone Jewish people, but to preserve.
Okay, let Professor Dershowitz respond.
I'm saying the United States government has formally announced that the end of the ceasefire was completely the fault of Hamas, that Hamas rejected the offers put forward by the United States government to release a certain number of hostages, and then the ceasefire would continue. And so the ceasefire ending is part of the effort to get the hostages back. The only way to get the hostages back is by putting pressure. In fact, it's working. Hamas announced just today that maybe it would consider, as the result of the bombing, as the result of the military attack, maybe it would consider releasing the hostages. If Hamas released all the hostages today, there'd be an end of this war. That's it. So it's all under the control of Hamas. Release the hostages.
So let me ask this, though. A senior Hamas official, Dr. Bassem Naim, yesterday said that the negotiators were on a verge of a breakthrough on that final negotiation before Prime Minister Netanyahu launched these strikes which broke the ceasefire. So was there ever negotiation in good faith?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you're saying.
I'll repeat my question to you. Just yesterday, Dr. Bassem Naim, a senior Hamas official, said that negotiators were on the verge of a breakthrough in the negotiations before Prime Minister Netanyahu launched the ceasefire ending strikes earlier in the week. So were there negotiations in good faith?
Well, first of all, the United States government has said it's all Hamas's fault, and it's very simple. Let Hamas release the hostages, and we'll see it.
Over and over. Wow.
There will be a ceasefire if Hamas releases the hostages. The only reason for the continuing fighting is to rescue the hostages, these people who are illegally being detained in violation of all international law. You hear Ahmed always piddling about Israel maybe violating this, maybe violating that. But
what are the families of the hostages doing? Are they piddling as well?
Every aspect of international law from the very beginning. So does he have any standing as a Hamas speaker, a Hamas representative, somebody who's opposed to the two-state solution? Does he have any standing even to criticize Israel?
Speaker? Is that what I am, Melinda? So he's allowed to say these things about me, right? I'm a Hamas speaker.
Okay, all right. Let's give Ahmed a right of reply there. He obviously has the right to defend himself.
I'm not interested in defending myself because I don't take anything he says to heart because it's all lies. What I'm interested in is defending the right of the Palestinian people to live in justice and dignity. And you would think that that wouldn't be so triggering to Alan or anyone who actually wants peace. Alan, I'm going to say this directly to you, although I know you're going to interrupt me. No matter how much legal jargon and threats and trying to associate me with Hamas and worse than Hamas you throw around, you are failing at sanitizing this. And the fact that you are here still trying to justify this and blame Hamas entirely, not just for the ceasefire falling through, but for their own ethnic cleansing, is why your own credibility is collapsing. For decades, Israel, like yourself, has been weaponizing language, and the world is waking up. Palestinians are no longer just statistics. They are teachers, doctors, children, human beings being exterminated in front of our eyes, and no amount of propaganda or interruptions can cover that up anymore. This isn't about Hamas. Hamas has only been around for 20 years, 20 odd years. If it were, as you say, about the hostages, Netanyahu would have taken the deal. But his power depends on war, which is why the same day he was supposed to go testify in his corruption. Can I finish without you interrupting me?
Okay.
I'm almost done.
Just really finish that statement, Ahmed. Professor, we're going to come to you straight after this to wrap it up. Ahmed, finish off very briefly. We're running out of time.
I just wonder how many more journalists like myself and you need to be killed by the Israeli government before people like Alan and others can actually admit that Israel is flagrantly committing war crimes and is not being held accountable precisely because of what we've agreed on this conversation, which is the U.S. is backing those war crimes.
Okay, Professor, right of reply to you before we end, and we are almost out of time.
Israel wants to live in peace and is perfectly happy to live in peace alongside Palestinians who live in peace. If Israel weren't the subject of what happened on October 7th, there would have been no war in Gaza. If Israel hadn't been attacked when it was first created in 1948, the Palestinians would have a wonderful, very large state. 100% of the fault for the Middle East crisis lies with the Palestinian leadership, with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem who refused to accept Israel, with Hamas, which refuses to accept Israel. If Hamas will simply return the hostages, lay down their arms, there will be peace. If Israel were to lay down its arms, there would be genocide. It's as simple as that. This is a one-sided issue. Israel wants peace. It wants to live alone. It wants to live in peace. The Palestinians want to see the end of Israel. Zionism is about building a state, Israel. Palestinianism and Hamas is about destroying the state. And that's why my distinguished opponent took...
Gentlemen, we could go on this ad infinitum, but I'm going to have to wrap it up there. I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you both. This has been a very lively discussion. I appreciate your time. Palestinian Kuwaiti journalist and analyst Ahmed Eldin and Professor Alan Dershowitz, the Emeritus Professor of Law at Harvard University. Thank you both for your time. And thank you for joining us here on Al Arabiya English. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any discussions like this one, and follow us on X and TikTok for all the latest content. This is Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora.